Part 3, Chapter 1 of Indian Boyhood by Charles Eastman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, My Plays and Playmates. Chapter 1, Games and Sports. The Indian boy was a prince of the wilderness. He had but very little work to do during the period of his boyhood. His principal occupation was the practice of a few simple arts in warfare and the chase. Aside from this, he was master of his time. Whatever was required of us boys was quickly performed. Then the field was clear for our games and plays. There was always keen competition among us. We felt very much as our fathers did in hunting and war. Each one strove to excel all the others. It is true that our savage life was a precarious one and full of dreadful catastrophes. However, this never prevented us from enjoying our sports to the fullest extent. As we left our teepees in the morning, we were never sure that our scalps would not dangle from a pole in the afternoon. It was an uncertain life, to be sure. Yet we observed that the fawns skipped and played happily, while the gray wolves might be peeping forth from behind the hills, ready to tear them limb from limb. Our sports were molded by the life and customs of our people. Indeed, we practiced only what we expected to do when grown. Our games were feats with the bow and arrow, foot and pony races, wrestling, swimming, and imitation of the customs and habits of our fathers. We had sham fights with mud balls and willow wands. We played lacrosse, made war upon bees, shot winter arrows, which were used only in that season, and coasted upon the ribs of animals and buffalo robes. No sooner did the boys get together than, as a usual thing, they divided into squads and chose sides. Then a leading arrow was shot at random into the air. Before it fell to the ground, a volley from the bows of the participants followed. Each player was quick to note the direction and speed of the leading arrow, and he tried to send his own at the same speed and at an equal height, so that when it fell it would be closer to the first than any of the others. It was considered out of place to shoot by first sighting the object aimed at. This was usually impracticable in actual life, because the object was almost always in motion, while the hunter himself was often upon the back of a pony at full gallop. Therefore it was the off-hand shot that the Indian boy sought to master. There was another game with arrows that was characterized by gambling, and was generally confined to the men. The races were an everyday occurrence. At noon the boys were usually gathered by some pleasant sheet of water, and as soon as the ponies were watered, they were allowed to graze for an hour or two, while the boys stripped for their noonday sports. A boy might say to some other whom he considered his equal, "I can't run, but I will challenge you to 50 paces." A former hero, when beaten, would often explain his defeat by saying, "I drank too much water." Boys of all ages prepared for a spin, and the little red men cheered on their favorites with spirit. As soon as this was ended, the pony races followed. All the speedy ponies were picked out and riders chosen. If a boy declined to ride, there would be shouts of derision. Last of all came the swimming. A little urchin would hang on to his pony's long tail, while the latter, with only his head above water, glided sportively along. Finally the animals were driven into a fine field of grass, and we turned our attention to other games. Lacrosse was an older game, and was confined entirely to the Sisseton and Santee Sioux. Shinny, such as is enjoyed by white boys on the ice, is still played on the open prairie by the western Sioux. The moccasin game, although sometimes played by the boys, was intended mainly for adults. The mud and willow fight was rather a severe and dangerous sport. A lump of soft clay was stuck on the end of a limber and springy willow wand and thrown, as boys throw apples from sticks, with considerable force. When there were 50 or 100 players on each side, the battle became warm, but anything to arouse the bravery of Indian boys seemed to them a good and wholesome diversion. Wrestling was largely indulged in by us all. It may seem odd, but wrestling was done by a great many boys at once, from 10 to any number on a side. It was really a battle, in which each one chose his opponent. The rule was that if a boy sat down he was let alone, but as long as he remained standing within the field he was open to an attack. No one struck with the hand, but all manner of tripping with legs and feet and butting with the knees was allowed. Altogether it was an exhausting pastime, fully equal to the American game of football, and only the young athlete could really enjoy it. One of our most curious sports was a war upon the nests of wild bees. We imagined ourselves about to make an attack upon the Ojibways, or some tribal foe. We all painted and stole cautiously upon the nest. Then, with a rush and a war whoop, sprang upon the object of our attack and endeavored to destroy it. But it seemed that the bees were always on the alert and never entirely surprised, for they always raised quite as many scalps as did their bold assailants. After the onslaught upon the nest was ended, we usually followed it by a pretended scalp dance. On the occasion of my first experience in this mode of warfare, there were two other little boys who were also novices. One of them particularly was really too young to indulge in an exploit of that kind. As it was the custom of our people, when they killed or wounded an enemy on the battlefield, to announce the fact in a loud voice, we did the same. My friend, Little Wound, as I will call him, for I do not remember his name, being quite small, was unable to reach the nest until it had been well trampled upon and broken, and the insects had made a countercharge with such vigor as to repulse and scatter our numbers in every direction. However, he evidently did not want to retreat without any honors, so he bravely jumped upon the nest and yelled, "I, the brave Little Wound, today kill the only fierce enemy." Scarcely were the last words uttered when he screamed as if stabbed to the heart. One of his older companions shouted, "Dive into the water! Run! Dive into the water!" for there was a lake near by. This advice he obeyed. When we had reassembled and were indulging in our mimic dance, Little Wound was not allowed to dance. He was considered not to be in existence. He had been killed by our enemies, the bee tribe. Poor little fellow! His swollen face was sad and ashamed as he sat on a fallen log and watched the dance. Although he might well have styled himself one of the noble dead who had died for their country, yet he was not unmindful that he had screamed, and this weakness would be apt to recur to him many times in the future. We had some quiet plays, which we alternated with the more severe and warlike ones. Among them were throwing wands and snow arrows. In the winter we coasted much. We had no double rippers or toboggans, but 6 or 7 of the long ribs of a buffalo, fastened together at the larger end, answered all practical purposes. Sometimes a strip of basswood bark, 4 feet long and about 6 inches wide, was used with considerable skill. We stood on one end and held the other, using the slippery inside of the bark for the outside, and thus coasting down long hills with remarkable speed. The spinning of tops was one of the all-absorbing winter sports. We made our tops, heart-shaped, of wood, horn, or bone. We whipped them with a long thong of buckskin. The handle was a stick about a foot long, and sometimes we whittled the stick to make it spoon-shaped at one end. We played games with these tops, 2 to 50 boys at one time. Each whips his top until it hums, then one takes the lead and the rest follow in a sort of obstacle race. The top must spin all the way through. There were bars of snow over which we must pilot our top in the spoon end of our whip. Then again we would toss it in the air or onto another open spot of ice or smooth snow crust from 20 to 50 paces away. The top that holds out the longest is the winner. Sometimes we played medicine dance. This to us was almost what playing church is among white children, but our people seemed to think it an act of irreverence to imitate these dances. Therefore, performances of this kind were always enjoyed in secret. We used to observe all the important ceremonies, and it required something of an actor to reproduce the dramatic features of the dance. The real dances occupied a day and a night, and the program was long and varied, so that it was not easy to execute all the details perfectly, but the Indian children are born imitators. The boys built an arbor of pine boughs in some out-of-the-way place, and at one end of it was a rude lodge. This was the medicine lodge, or headquarters. All the initiates were there. At the further end, or entrance, were the doorkeepers, or soldiers, as we called them. The members of each lodge entered in a body, standing in single file and facing the headquarters. Each stretched out his right hand, and a prayer was offered by the leader, after which they took the places assigned to them. When the preliminaries had been completed, our leader sounded the big drum, and we all said, "Ah, ho, ho, ho," as a sort of amen. Then the choir began their song, and whenever they ended a verse, we all said again, "Ah, ho, ho, ho." At last they struck up the chorus, and we all got upon our feet and began to dance by simply lifting up one foot and then the other, with a slight swing to the body. Each boy was representing or imitating some one of the medicine men. We painted and decorated ourselves just as they did, and carried a bird or squirrel skins, or occasionally live birds and chipmunks, as our medicine bags, and small white shells or pebbles for medicine charms. Then the persons to be initiated were brought in and seated, with much ceremony, upon a blanket or buffalo robe. Directly in front of them the ground was leveled smooth, and here we laid an old pipe filled with dried leaves for tobacco. Around it we placed the variously colored feathers of the birds we had killed, and cedar and sweet grass we burned for incense. Finally, those of us who had been selected to perform this ceremony stretched out our arms at full length, holding the sacred medicine bags and aiming them at the new members. After swinging them 4 times, we shot them suddenly forward, but did not let go. The novices then fell forward on their faces as if dead. Quickly a chorus was struck up, and we all joined in a lively dance around the supposed bodies. The girls covered them up with their blankets, thus burying the dead. At last we resurrected them with our charms and led them to their places among the audience. Then came the last general dance and the final feast. I was often selected as choir master on these occasions, for I had happened to learn many of the medicine songs and was quite an apt mimic. My grandmother, who was a noted medicine woman of the Turtle Lodge, on hearing of these sacrilegious acts, as she called them, warned me that if any of the medicine men should discover them, they would punish me terribly by shriveling my limbs with slow disease. Occasionally we also played white man. Our knowledge of the paleface was limited, but we had learned that he brought goods whenever he came, and that our people exchanged furs for his merchandise. We also knew that his complexion was pale, that he had short hair on his head and long hair on his face, and that he wore coat, trousers, and hat, and did not patronize blankets in the daytime. This was the picture we had formed of the white man. So we painted 2 or 3 of our number with white clay, and put on them birchen hats, which we sewed up for the occasion, fastened a piece of fur to their chins for a beard, and altered their costumes as much as lay within our power. The white of the birch bark was made to answer for their white shirts. Their merchandise consisted of sand for sugar, wild beans for coffee, dried leaves for tea, pulverized earth for gunpowder, pebbles for bullets, and clear water for the dangerous spirit water. We traded for these goods with skins of squirrels, rabbits, and small birds. When we played hunting buffalo, we would send a few good runners off on the open prairie with a supply of meat, then start a few equally swift boys to chase them and capture the food. Once we were engaged in this sport when a real hunt by the men was in progress, yet we did not realize that it was so near, until in the midst of our play we saw an immense buffalo coming at full speed directly toward us. Our mimic buffalo hunt turned into a very real buffalo scare. Fortunately, we were near the edge of the woods, and we soon disappeared among the leaves like a covey of young prairie chickens, and some hid in the bushes, while others took refuge in tall trees. We loved to play in the water. When we had no ponies, we often had swimming matches of our own, and sometimes made rafts with which we crossed lakes and rivers. It was a common thing to duck a young or timid boy, or to carry him into deep water to struggle as best he might. I remember a perilous ride with a companion on an unmanageable log, when we were both less than 7 years old. The older boys had put us on this uncertain bark and pushed us out into the swift current of the river. I cannot speak for my comrade in distress, but I can say now that I would rather ride on a swift bronco any day than try to stay on and steady a short log in a river. I never knew how we managed to prevent a shipwreck on that voyage and to reach the shore. We had many curious wild pets. There were young foxes, bears, wolves, raccoons, fawns, buffalo calves, and birds of all kinds, tamed by various boys. My pets were different at different times, but I particularly remember one. I once had a grizzly bear for a pet, and so far as he and I were concerned, our relations were charming and very close. But I hardly know whether he made more enemies for me or I for him. It was his habit to treat every boy unmercifully who injured me. He was despised for his conduct in my interest, and I was hated on account of his interference. End of Part 3, Chapter 1.